Ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our three speakers today. First, I'll start off, and it's a panel member. It's Dr. David Johnson. He's online, retired from the U.S. Army at the rank of Colonel. Dr. Johnson served for 24 years as an infantryman, quartermaster, and field artilleryman. He currently serves as an adjunct professor at the Modern War Institute at West Point. Prior to that position, he served as a senior fellow and researcher at institutions such as Georgetown, RAND, Science Applications International Corporation, National Defense University, and the National War College. And then we have immediately to my right, Dr. Seth Jones serves as a Senior Vice President, Harold Brown Chair, Director of the International Securities Program, and Director of the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Jones previously served as a Director for International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation, the representative for the commander of U.S. Special Operations Command to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. In 2014, Dr. Jones served on the congressionally mandated panel that reviewed the FBI's implementation of the counterterrorism recommendations contained in the 9/11 Commission report. And at the far end of the table is Colonel retired John Antel, currently a member of the U.S. Army Science Board, working on future warfighting solutions for the Secretary of the Army. Also a former combat arms officer, Colonel Antel served for 30 years in the U.S. Army in notable jobs such as the commander of the 16th Cavalry Regiment and the special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. After the Army, he worked for 15 years in the corporate sector, including with Microsoft, and as the executive director for a mega-selling video game developer. A former managing editor of the Armchair General magazine, he still serves as a correspondent for military technology and the Mittler-Verlag Report. So now just into some of the business rules as we move forward. As your monitor, I'm really up here to be an imposing figure if you go over your time and to help direct some of the questions. So we'll be conducting a panel in a traditional manner, serving each panelist providing between 5 to 7 minutes of talking to quickly provide their perspective on, what was that, sir? We can go 10? Okay, 15. Okay, so the boss has given you 15 minutes now. So we can go 15 minutes each, and then following those questions, we'll take, following that, we'll take questions from the audience, and then each panel member can take a shot at moving through that. And Colonel Saddleland will help moderate some of the questions as we pull them in from online and offline as we just negotiate our system with David Johnson on the other line. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jones. Sir, you're next.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It is really an honor to be here. Thanks for the invite. My comments are based on an unclassified, for the moment anyway, study for the Office of Net Assessments in the Department of Defense. That study looks at both Russian operations in Syria as well as in Ukraine. It's been fascinating to watch the Russians operate in two major wars. They operated quite differently. As we saw this morning in the comments from General Donahue and others, the range of lessons that one can pull out of the Russian campaign in Ukraine. I want to talk about a few here today. These are obviously not the only ones, but I think they are several important ones that have implications for the future, not just of how we fight, but also our assessment of how adversaries may fight and what kinds of weapon systems and concept of operations, platforms that they may use. So let me go to the next slide. What I'd like to do is start off with the concept of innovation. And one of the things that has been interesting is to watch, as we heard with listening to the Ukrainians this morning, how the Ukrainians have innovated. I mean, I think for any of you old enough to remember the television series MacGyver, there is a MacGyver element to how the Ukrainians have operated on the battlefield. We see it at maybe that shows my age, by the way. We've seen it at the tactical level. They've mounted Neptune missiles onto trucks. They placed rocket systems onto speedboats. They've developed plastic aircraft modified to drop grenades. They've rejiggered target sensors and placed HARM anti-radiation missiles on MiG-29s. And they've also developed, quite interestingly, fleets of decoy HIMARS that have tricked the Russians into firing fairly expensive caliber cruise missiles against targets. So really interesting. What I wanted to focus on the innovation side, though, was how the Ukrainians have used quite effectively unmanned systems as part of combined arms warfare. Because I think, as certainly I used during my time in the Department of Defense and forward deployed, we used a lot of UASs for ISR collection and then strike, particularly against terrorists. But we're seeing an evolution in how they're being used on the battlefield. So if we go to the next slide. We're seeing them really used as part of combined arms in ways that we had not operated to this extent in the past. And so, you know, in the future, whether we're involved in predominantly ground or ground and maritime or ground air maritime, you know, the use of UASs as part of battle networks and kill chains with 5th generation aircraft and long-range bombers, including the new B-21, helicopters, aircraft carriers, expeditionary area bases. What's been interesting, though, I think, as I have looked on the tactical side of the Ukrainian use, is how they have used these for a range of types of activities. Domain awareness, just to understand the situation. Before war, the Russian invasion. When the war started, battlefield awareness and early warning. Targeting for standoff attacks, and the Ukrainians have developed software, including that you can hold up using an iPad for artillery to strike targets. They've used them for strikes. We've seen the TB2s. They've used them for EW. They've used them effectively for information operations, and we heard a little bit about that this morning, including on social media, where they've highlighted the targeting of Russian troops and then put that out on social media. If we go to the next slide, it is interesting as we look at Chinese lessons from the war in Ukraine. If we look at, say, the Chinese FH-95 electronic warfare UAS, it's on the next slide, if we can go there. We've seen the Chinese and we've seen the Russians. I don't want to talk much here about the Orlan 10, the 4-post, the Orlan 50, or the Russian UASs, but just to highlight here that the Chinese are learning the importance of UASs as well. So they're developing the Soaring Dragon, the GJ-11, the Flying Swan, that's the FH-95. And if you look here, it's got ELINT, ESM, electronic warfare payloads, to collaborate with manned and unmanned platforms to conduct deep strikes against enemy targets. So other adversaries are taking interesting lessons from the Russian and Ukrainian use of UASs on the battlefield. Next, probably a little more controversial. There had been a lot of hype going into this war about the game-changing nature of offensive cyber operations. I don't want to deny the critical importance of cyber operations. But what's been interesting is that cyber operations so far on the offensive side may not be quite the game changer that some had predicted. Despite Russian offensive operations, if we go to the next slide, the Russians used cyber at multiple periods of this war to attempt to blind Ukrainian command and control capabilities. They failed, particularly for prolonged period of times. So we saw a lot of malware attacks by Russian GRU and SVR and FSB agencies, particularly destructive wiper attacks. But these attacks did not significantly blind the Ukrainian capability to communicate and fight for prolonged period, and certainly did not impair Ukrainian ability and will to fight. So one broader lesson may be, as we look at this, is that offensive cyber will certainly have an important role to play, but perhaps its utility is fleeting. So what it means is it needs to be exploited quickly and in combination with other tools. Obviously, despite these limitations, cyber will still be important for intelligence collection, for electronic warfare, and a range of other purposes. And we've seen the Chinese in particular looking at lessons along these lines. So I go to the next slide, and I will talk about a little bit later Microsoft and Starlink and other organizations involved, because that's a new part of this as well. So defeat of units. So what are we learning? There's clearly still an incredible fog of war, but as we've looked at the defeat of units, including the Russian defeat at tactical levels of the battlefield on Kyiv front and the Kharkiv front more recently during the Kharkiv offensive, if we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things, partly also to highlight for how we conceptualize looking at adversaries in the future. There has been a lack of small unit cohesion and initiative. The Russians do not have anything resembling at least a U.S. Professional non-commissioned officer corps, which almost certainly, I think, highly likely inhibited cohesion at the local level. These deficiencies added to morale problems within the Russian military. And so what we saw is small unit leaders at various points of even the initial parts of the invasion. They just could not break with the Soviet tradition of passively waiting for orders rather than taking the initiative. And there was just a notable concern about making mistakes and how higher level commanders would view that. So as we look at the future of warfare, and again, I want to talk here about the Chinese and the Russians in the future, I think it is important to understand how these types of militaries operate, and how do we take advantage of weaknesses and vulnerabilities as we fight them. So the propensity of some of these militaries to avoid decision-making at lower levels and to push decision-making up the chains of command has an ability in some cases to impact their ability to take the initiative. There's an additional interesting impact of defeat among some Russian units, which is the high rate of officer attrition that the Ukrainians have taken advantage of. I mean, partly because of the command and control structure, which I just outlined. We have seen a lot of senior Russian officers, including General Gerasimov, come from Moscow to go to the front lines or come close to the front lines. That's taking serious risks. So the Ukrainians, with some help, have targeted these mid and senior level officers. And I would just highlight the impact that has had on combat proficiency has been significant. Russian units have flailed following the decapitation of some of their officers. This does raise interesting questions when facing some types of militaries along these lines. Is to what degree to aggressively target senior level officers in militaries with these heavily bureaucratized and centralized command and control structures, because it has severely impacted performance on the battlefield. There are a lot of things that I think others will talk about. We talked about this morning on long-range fires and logistics in a contested environment. But let me move to a fourth area. So if we go to the next slide, which is the use of partners and proxies. And I think what's interesting is that what we have in the U.S.'s major competitors, countries like China and Russia, are nuclear weapons. If we look back at the Cold War, policymakers that sit at the top of those countries have a tendency to be very cautious about direct conventional war with nuclear-armed adversaries because of the costs and risks involved. I mean, you're potentially risking populations if nuclear missiles are shot at New York City or Washington or Chicago or Dallas or Denver. And so what we've seen, interestingly, in the case of Ukraine is a willingness to fight, in our case, but to provide multiple types of conventional assistance to the Ukrainians. I suspect we'll see a lot of these over the next couple of decades. So we talked a little about SFABs this morning, but I think the idea here, in part, is that assistance to foreign militaries, both in training, in equipment, and in a range of other aspects, will likely be a major proponent. Remember, the vast majority of the fights against the Soviet Union during the Cold War were in Latin America and Africa and other places, not on the Fulda Gap where we had prepared for that. So I take that as an interesting aspect, and it does lead to challenges. Our defense industrial base, including our munitions, is been seriously, it's under some constraints right now. So I think it's going to cause us to hopefully make some industrial base changes. We just go to a couple of last issues. Private sector. So next slide. One more. And then actually, if we can go to the next slide. I think one of the interesting things that we're also seeing, we talked about OSINT this morning, is the growing role of the private sector on the battlefield, not just for space-based systems, including satellite imagery, which we've seen, but also companies getting directly involved in cyber defense, the way Microsoft did, and the way Starlink and Elon Musk did in providing command and control capabilities that the Ukrainians use, not just for defensive purposes, but also for offensive purposes as well. So I would just highlight our battlefield is getting congested. This does raise questions about who combatants are, but I would just offer that we're seeing private sector entities involved in offensive and defensive cyber operations, the leveraging of commercial satellite capabilities, engaging in a range of types of open source intelligence, orchestrating information and disinformation campaigns, and then as we see with the Russians on the ground in Ukraine right now, the use of private military companies, including Wagner Group, which are operating in over 36 countries in the world. And then so last comment, just to wrap it up, if we go to the next slide, and then one more, is just to raise a broader question as we prepare to fight in the future. How do a number of folks, both outside and inside of the U.S. intelligence community, underappreciated the Ukrainian capabilities and how they would fight, and overstated the Russians. And this was less about the capabilities that those countries had, because the Russians have reasonable equipment. Their doctrine, if you look at it, was sound. They just didn't abide by it, at least in the early stages. But this does raise questions about how do we assess a foreign military, an adversary's ability to conduct complex operations and logistics, huge problems for the Russians. Morale, including corruption within entities and inefficiency. And then will soldiers and commanders and even units actually follow their own military doctrine, which we paid quite a bit of attention to. So I will leave you with a series of questions as we look toward the future. But let me just say one last thing to quote the Prussian statesman Otto von Bismarck, which is, he said, "Fools learn only by experience. I prefer to profit by others' experiences, which is why I think taking a close look at the Russian campaign in Ukraine is actually quite important." Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Jones, thank you so much for those comments. And the audience out there, get ready to start jotting down your questions as we get ready to move to our next panelist, John Antal. Sir, you're next.
Okay. First of all, let me correct the record. I was in the Army Science Board from 2018 to 2021. No longer am. I am a soldier for life. My name is John Antel. How many of you read? How many of you have read 10 books a year? Okay, great. Now give me a lieutenant or a captain or a sergeant who's read 10 books a year down here right now and get a free book. From the senior leaders course, you know all about this. The guys who know Nagorno-Karabakh, come on down here. Volunteer, let's go. Come on, hustle. You know who you are. Get down here. Here you go. All right, outstanding. Read that. Okay, first slide, please. All right, I want to talk a little bit about battle space disruptors. That's what I call them. These are things that are changing the methods of warfare. but I'm not going to go through all 8. Normally I have a presentation of 8. We're just going to go through the top 3. Now let me start with this. Leadership matters. Leadership matters. Technology's great, but leadership matters. We need leaders with foresight. Foresight is the ability to solve problems in the short term and create solutions for the long run. Solve problems in the short term and create solutions for the long run. We desperately need leaders with foresight. To get that foresight, you have to read, you have to study, you have to discuss and dialogue, and one of the things you should do is red team and war game. And when somebody tells you, like, what's going to happen in Ukraine, don't answer the question with, this guy's going to win or that guy's going to lose. Come up with 3 courses of action, right? That's the way you've been trained. Come up with possibilities. Give them 3 scenarios, win, lose, or draw, and what does that look like? Now, next slide. So these are the 8 top warfighting disruptors. You should take a picture of this with your smartphone. Now, the reason that these are important is because if you look at any exercise you do at any level of our operations, these will affect your operations. And if in fact you think about these and take action to mitigate some of the problems, you will in fact do better. Next slide. Now, go ahead, back up 1 slide please for me. We're going to talk about these 3 with the white stars. The transparent battle space. The transparent battle space. What that means is that everything on the battle space today, all the way back to the United States of America, can be seen. They can see us when we leave home station. They can see us when we get on boats. They can see us everywhere. And there are sensors now in the battle space, and they're growing in greater and greater number that are both in the space, in sky, and on the ground that will find you. The Ukrainians are able to find Russian command posts. Over 50 plus have been destroyed or have been hit since the beginning of the war. Many of the people operating those command posts were killed or wounded. So imagine if 50 of our command posts, battalion, brigade, division, corps, were hit within this 6-month period. That would be an amazing disruption. It's almost incredible that they're still fighting. Those kind of strikes happen because the battle space is transparent. The enemy can see you. There are no sanctuaries. You have to train as if there are no sanctuaries. And you must mask in 5 areas. The first area you know well, optical. We have to be able to take away the optical spectrum. In other words, camouflage. And of course, we're the best at camouflage in the world, right? No. What does it take to do camouflage? 3 things, I think. It takes leadership, it takes discipline, and it takes kit. In other words, the right equipment. You provide the leadership. You enforce the discipline and use the kit you've got until we get better kit. We need better kit. But we have to take away that first area in the transparent battle space, the optical area. We have to be able to hide. Next, you have to be able to do everything you can to reduce your thermal signature. And you go, you gotta be kidding me. I have an M1 tank. How do I reduce the thermal signature? Start figuring it out. Don't wait for somebody else to solve your problems. Don't tell me what you can't do. Tell me what you can do. What if you took your M1s out and you practiced looking through thermal viewers on how you could dampen their signature in different ways? Figure out how to dampen them as much as you can. Now, we need systems in the future that are designed with thermal dampening in mind. None of our systems right now have that. So thermal is a problem, but we'll talk about some mitigation for that in a bit. The next is electronic. We are an army that swims in a sea of electrons. We emit, they find us. There are loitering munitions like the Harop, which can orbit for 6 to 12 hours depending on the version. The Azerbaijanis had it in the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. And they had it, and they were able to find the Armenian air defense systems that used radar and destroy them. So what we have to do is we have to figure out how to limit our electronic signature. And one of the ways you can do that is think about this. Could your unit go to electronic silence? Wow. Could your unit go to electronic silence? What if you were in an assembly area and you turned everything off for 2 hours? Could you do it? And if you could, would you even know if anything was on? Figure it out. Now that's just one thing. There's other things we can do. The next area that we have to understand in the transparent battle space is acoustic. No kidding. Now all of you know that when you were looking for the talk in the middle of the night in a blackout situation in training and you couldn't find it, you took your helmet off and you listened for the generators. Well, the enemy will do the same thing, but now their robots listen to you. UAS have acoustic sensors. They zero in on the explosion of guns, on generators, and they will find you with acoustics. So we have to dampen the noise. Not an easy thing to do. The next is quantum. Don't worry about quantum right now. But there are quantum sensors being developed, particularly by China, to see our stealth aircraft. You need to be aware of it. You don't need to not necessarily do it. So we have to figure out how to operate and survive on a transparent battle space. That's number one. Number two, which worries me a lot, the first strike advantage. How many of us are going to be in the first wave of the attack on China when we attack China? Right. We're not going to attack China. But China might attack us. Now, Russia says they're at war with us. And we go, we're not at war with you. Wait a minute. We're in a hybrid war right now with Russia. If your troops were being killed by Russian-made HIMARS with money from Russia, with intelligence from Russia and other equipment from Russia, would you be at war with us? Think about it. That's how they feel, and they're going to ask for revenge someday. So we're in a hybrid war with Russia now. China says they're at war with us, and we say, oh, you're just kidding. So maybe that won't happen? I don't know. But what we have to do is this. We're not going to strike first. I can't imagine a situation where you will be deployed where we're crossing into their borders. But I can imagine many scenarios, and so can you, where you're deployed to some country, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, some island somewhere, and we're waiting. And if we're waiting in assembly areas and they get the first strike advantage, we have a huge problem. How will you survive the first strike advantage? You have to think about this. The next one is top attack. The preferred method of combat today is top attack. We used to worry about the frontal glacis of the tank as being the important thing, and it still is important, but it's not the most important thing now. Then we worried about them blowing us up from the bottom, which was something that we took a technological solution to fix, and we made all sorts of vehicles so we wouldn't get blown up from the bottom. But now the IEDs fly. And all those unmanned aerial systems, particularly the loitering munitions and the unmanned combat aerial vehicles, the UCAVs, attack you from the top. There have not been major tank battles in Ukraine. There were no major tank battles in the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. And there were lots of tanks involved. So we need to think through that. Now the tank is very important, and combined arms is very important. But top attack, Javelin, NLAWs, unmanned aerial systems, loitering munitions. These things are the cheaper and easier way to destroy systems, and it's from the top. So you must work on your top attack awareness. You must have an unmanned aerial vehicle flying above you all the time. It cost almost nothing to get a small SUAS out of the GSA catalog, put it on a tether, and have it record your training. But develop top attack awareness so you can do this. So these three things, transparent battle space, first strike advantage, top attack, how are we going to solve the problem? How are we going to fight this? It's a multifaceted effort, but here is one way. And here's one thing that you need to do. It starts with changing our thinking. Everything happens by thinking first and then acting. Think, then act. Next slide. Write this down or copy it. We need to think masking. Masking is the full spectrum, multi-domain effort to deceive enemy sensors and disrupt enemy targeting. Deceive their sensors and disrupt their targeting. We need to deceive their sensors so they can't find us easily. So we use decoys. And you say, I don't have any decoys. And I say, get some E-type silhouettes and put them out next to your position. Put some thermal blankets on them. Or have them even better, put the thermal blankets on the ground because top attack is one of your big problems. Figure out ways to make decoys. Put smudge pots out in the field. Put up a decoy of a fake CP. Every time you set up a command post, set up a fake command post. Put up some camouflage nets in a tent that you're not going to need because the tent won't protect you. So deceiving the enemy sensors is vital, and there's lots of ways we can do it, and it's multi-domain. Putting more false positives on the battle space than they can hit, and then disrupting their targeting, disrupt their kill chain. All of you operate in units at some point, or will when you're out of school, that will have kill chains. How many steps are in your average kill chain? You need to know. How many steps are in the average enemy kill chain? You need to know. As commanders, how in fact could you disrupt the enemy's kill chain? If he finds you with sensors but can't hit you, that's good. So let me leave you with this. There's an old adage, and you've heard it earlier in this course, in this conference. And they say that amateurs study tactics and professionals study logistics. Well, let me tell you, masters of the art of war in the 21st century, they understand tactics, they understand logistics, and they understand masking. Because masking should be a principle of war. Masking is so important. We will not be able to fight in future battle spaces unless we embrace the concept. It starts with thinking, and then everything else flows from that. The TTP, the tactics, all the things that we need, the equipment will flow first from the thinking. And it's not even in our lexicon. It's not in our dictionary. Make masking something you do every day when it comes to taking care of your soldiers in the 21st century battle space. Next slide. Now, the methods of warfare are changing. Soldiers are our asymmetric advantage. You. The rest of the nations in the world can't produce what you can do. You're better than any machine. But leveraging with the right machines, you can be unbeatable. The enemy wants to defeat us by attacking that asymmetric advantage and using their technology. In order for us to change, we have to study, we have to read, and we have to continue to dialogue about the future nature of war. Next slide. Now, these are presentations and discussions that I give by MS Teams to any unit in the Army or Marine Corps, and I've done many Marines, and even some of our allies. I'm doing Australians next week, at no cost. I do this as a soldier for life. I don't charge for this. All we have to do is arrange for our schedules, and we do it by MS Teams. So if you have a LPD, an NCOPD, or you have a group discussion that you need, I'd be happy to talk with any of you about any of these 7 different topics. Next slide. That is my email address. Take a picture of this, contact me. We can work out a schedule. I will work with you. Army strong.
Thanks, sir. Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. And Dr. Johnson, it's your net now.
It's your net
You've got
now.
it for 15
Got it for
minutes.
15 minutes.
Over.
Over.
Roger, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Loud and clear.
Loud and clear.
Okay. Well, I want to show you today what I've been observing in the Ukraine war to date and what I think it can tell us about ourselves. I'm going to confine my insights to those that I think are most relevant to maneuver leaders given the time we have. My sense is that we should be taking this as a 1973 Yom Kippur War, Arab-Israeli war moment, when the U.S. military realized it had an opportunity to study a conflict that looks something like what it might have to fight against in the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and learn from the Israeli experience. As John said, learning from somebody else's experience. I also believe that for the first time since World War II, we actually face the reality of conflict with competent, well-equipped adversaries in the Pacific and Europe that can contest us in all the domains and have significant home field advantages. I also believe that we are seeing a reemergence of the defense as a dominant form of war, which is a good thing for the U.S. military because our mission is deterrence of aggression, not reversing aggression. I also believe that the Army has central competition and deterrence and winning in both theaters it was in World War II. And that finally, China and Russia give us the key elements of a military problem that has three components: the place, the adversary, and the adversary's capabilities. Consequently, unlike the Cheshire Cat's advice that Alice in the slide, it does matter which way we go. And we know that that path leads to preparing for large-scale combat against China and Russia. Finally, this war has some very important insights that can shape our course in the future if we let it. I'm going to leave these slides behind, so listen to my comments because they may differ somewhat from the slides. Next slide. The United States has become accustomed to short, decisive precision wars with low casualties. We're on the next slide. Ukraine showing that the size of the theater of war and a relatively small number of forces can result in protraction and a grinding war of attrition. In this war, the Russians have been doing what they do, relying on artillery to conquer and infantry to occupy. They're not confused that they don't have really good NCOs, and they make do with the army they have. But by the way, it's the same kind of army that beat the Nazi Wehrmacht, the best army in the world in World War II. We should also remember the Russians are often called an artillery army with tanks. And I think there's a lot of implications from how long a war will last. From a military perspective, there are huge implications, as have been alluded to already, for the industrial base. Can you sustain consumption and relate end items? You see the cost of one Excalibur here. Essentially, for a cheap 155 round, you can buy up to 500 conventional rounds. But other than that, can you sustain public support? I think we're going to see a challenge with that in NATO this fall and winter. And can you justify protracted expense at the opportunity cost of other priorities? How bad will inflation get before we start asking these questions? Next slide. I worry we're not prepared for the level of casualties on both sides that are being suffered, that I believe are really representative of large-scale state warfare. In our operations since Vietnam, we've come to expect low casualties and immediate medical care for our wounded. In these wars, as in Korea and Vietnam, soldiers are a precious currency that may have to be spent wisely as possible to achieve objectives. Instead of force protection, the imperative is force preservation and unit reconstitution to keep yourself in the fight. You have to kill what's killing your people, not take care immediately of the people that are being armed. This is a huge issue, both within the military and among policymakers, and I don't think we're prepared for it. We did a study back in the early 2000s on this, and our medical structure in moderate scale combat collapsed within 10 hours. Next chart. So we also need to come to grips with the implications of information technology on the battlefield. I think we have two real challenges. First, smartphones and other personal devices, and second, the large electronic signatures that we've alluded to with the Russian headquarters. By the way, we keep talking about how heavy Russian losses are with their officers. There's a TRADOC G2 study that earlier I think was presented. Our losses are pretty much during World War II with flag officers and Russian officers are about the same. The difference is we're in high-end combat where everybody's at risk, not just the people in the squad and platoon. Second, I think a lot of these, both of these create just huge OPSEC issues because they can be monitored information. And as John said, if they can be located, they can be targeted. Finally, a piece that, is relatively new in the last 20 years, these personal devices add a real challenge to managing the message, creating Abu Ghraib-like moments. And I'm not going to offer any alternatives to this. I have a friend that went to NCC and he took the cell phones, PDAs, iPhones away from his troops 72 hours in advance. And it was like you'd taken their crack dealer away from them. They're going to visit the chaplain and asking the JAG if it was legal to do this. We've become so used to these. Second, I think the signature, size, mobility, and survivability of our headquarters put our command and control at risk. We are no different than the Russians, and we're probably absolutely worse. We've become, next slide. Can you go back one? So I think we become used to these gigantic castles on FOBs in places that are pretty much invulnerable, that have everything we want to communicate and do command and control without any regard to can we move it and can it be found, because we hadn't had to worry about that for 30 years. We need to start worrying about it. Because if you can be found, which electronic signatures is the easiest way to do it, you can be hit. And this is an area where I hear people, well, we'll get better at it. This is an area where getting better is not good enough. If you don't come up with ideas that you're gone before the volley hits, it doesn't matter if you were able to move in an hour rather than 2 hours, you're still dead. So we got to get back to the idea of multiple headquarters that hand off to each other. I was in Brigade FSO in 1980 in the 1st Armored Division, and our brigade TAC consisted of 2577 command tracks. The brigade commander was M60, 3 Jeeps and a truck. We talked, then we moved. It takes hours now for similar level headquarters to move. Next chart. So I also want to take a moment to say that the obituaries on tanks coming out of the Nagorno-Karabakh and Ukraine are just absolutely wrong. The question is not, is the tank obsolete? We never asked the first order question in these early insights, which is, in this case, is there a requirement for mobile survivable lethality on future battlefields? If there is, what is the best means to provide the capability? Right now, it's the tank. We had those discussions after 73 with the introduction of Sagers, in 2006 with the introduction of Cornets and advanced RPGs. And there was always a combination of a technical and a tactical solution to solve the problem. Overhead extension of trophy for top attack systems, battle drills, combined arms fire maneuver to deal with manpads and ATGMs. But I think the statement at the end here that tanks are like dinner jackets, you don't need them very often, but when you do, nothing else will do, remains apt. Next chart. I'm not going to spend any time on this other than say we have heavied up our vehicles for force protection. It has significant implications for mobility from the tactical to the strategic levels. Where is the Army willing to take risks? IEDs are not the most significant threat in large-scale combat operations, and they should not drive design. The M1 originally weighed 51 tons. The 73 is 79, it's 90 tons with a mine plow. It can't get on German rail. It can't traverse the majority of bridging. There's not enough heft. We got to do something about this. And we've been talking about it for 10 years. And we get the OMFV cross-functional team leader who was there in Poland when they deployed forward there and asked him the challenges he had. We got to lighten up the force. Next chart. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this either, other than to say that what's really changed, I think, in the last 20 years, in my view, is the ubiquity of unmanned systems, not just at the the large scale predator level, but at the small scale hobby shop drone all the way up to whatever level you want. They're incredible for all sorts of missions. They can be weaponized, as we know. And the real challenge to those that are being employed against are the numbers and how cheap and available they are. So I think development and fielding of systems to protect from overhead attack, as well as take out these drones, should be a real priority. Next slide. So I think Ukraine is also showing the high risk posed by air defenses to both rotary and fixed-wing aircraft. We don't know the exact number of losses because the Ukrainians, quite frankly, have been extremely good at controlling the message for their side. But we do know that tactical and technical changes will have to be made to the fleet to make it survivable in this area. And it's harder than ground platforms because this all adds weight. But we also need to ask ourselves what concepts in ground combined arms fire maneuver need to be modified if we can't count on air superiority, which we've absolutely believed in since the Korean War. Finally, other areas need to be looked at really closely to see what the effect will be on areas like medevac, which we will probably not be able to rely on aerial medevacuation. Next slide. I would offer a caution about our approach to viewing events in Ukraine. The service will understandably look at the war from their own perspectives. That is to be expected and reasonable because the warfighting expertise in the various domains resides within the individual services. But the Department of Defense must also recognize that the services will apply filters, either wittingly or unwittingly, to many of their individual observations. Indeed, at the extreme, a conflict may elicit very different conclusions and recommended solutions, depending on the service making the assessment. In the Army during the interwar period, the branch chiefs held great authority over the branch's doctrine, personnel, and material requirements. The Air Force had not yet gained independence and was part of the Army. In February 1942, Major General John Hare, the U.S. Army Chief of Cavalry, met with Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, and he told him something he truly believed. In the interest of national defense in this crisis, I urge upon you the necessity of an immediate increase in horse cavalry. This is after Poland, France had fallen to the Blitzkrieg and Germany was driving into Russia. But from his perch, with the experience of a full and successful career, Hare viewed horse cavalry as a key reason for the German successes in Poland and France. He honestly believed what he told Marshall, and Germany did have horse cavalry formation. Thus, if you look for validating observations, they were there. The other Army branches also searched for supported lessons. The Chief of Infantry highlighted the contribution of German infantry, while the Army Air Corps contended that strategic bombing in Warsaw had been central to the German victory over Poland. Finally, the chief of the newly formed armored force based its concepts largely on armored cavalry missions of exploitation and pursuit that the commander of the 7th Cavalry Brigade, Admiral Chaffee, who became head of the armored force, had developed. He saw the use of tanks by the Germans as a validation of this approach, even though it did not remotely resemble the Blitzkrieg. The branch chiefs all missed the reality of the Blitzkrieg because it combined armor and air power, and there was enormous contention between the air and ground branches in the Army at this time. Indeed, armored force doctrinal manuals did not require air support for operations. Consequently, the Army, less the disbanded horse cavalry, took its existing concept and weapons into the war, where we suffered unnecessarily for their parochial decisions. However, it is important to understand that all these senior officers believe their validating observations. It would be difficult for them to expect to see and believe something that conflicted with what they have spent their careers mastering. I leave with the thought we have to do better than they did as we attempt to learn the lessons of this war before we find ourselves in a similar situation. Next slide. I'm going to leave a copy of my slides, like I said. If anybody who's interested, this is a list of the articles I've been writing since mid-April that I've been trying to think through myself about what all this means. But thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Sure, thank you very much. And just as we get ready to query the crowd for some questions, I'm going to lead off with the first question. For our leaders, especially our younger leaders, there's a daunting amount of information and news that's out there in the environment. And often much of it is misinformation. Any tips on where our young leaders should be looking for their information or what they should be reading?
Okay, I got the first one up. Here's how you solve that problem. Think. Figure it out yourself. Nobody can give you a list. But I'll tell you what, if you start reading the Russian newspapers, which you can get online, and the Ukrainian General Staff information, which you can get online, and the Taipei News and the Chinese Global, you can get all this information, open source, takes you a few minutes every morning, and you can get a vision of what they're thinking. Now, when you start getting down into TTP and things like that, you got to start studying the systems. Do it yourself. Think it through. Somebody else's list isn't going to work for you. See?
I just wanted to add one comment as we look at lessons that we need to learn, and there are a range of places that we can go for these. I would also pay attention. There's some useful places that are translating documents. CSIS has a Interpret China that includes a number of translated documents on what the Chinese are learning from the wars in Russia and Ukraine. So I would add to any list you have what the adversaries are learning from the wars as well.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and transition to some questions from the audience. So you can raise your hand. You wanted a person in the audience to move to you and take your question for the panel. All right, gentlemen, we have a question for panel number 3.
Good afternoon. Thanks for that presentation. And I think my question's for Dr. Jones. My name's Steve Carey. I'm from the U.S. Army Nuclear and CWMD Agency. You brought up strategic nuclear weapons and the idea of deterrence. With the capability that, and by the way, any of the panelists can chime in if you want, but with the capability that Russia has with regard to low-yield, non-strategic nuclear weapons and their use on the battlefield and their doctrine, what does that do to the maneuver force commander, and how should maneuver commanders change the way they think about WMD on the battlefield in the tactical and in the theater context rather than the strategic context? Thank you.
That's an interesting question, and we may see that play out at some point in the foreseeable future. I mean, my sense is in talking to some number of Ukrainians on the battlefield and keeping this in unclassified at the unclassified level. My general sense is that the for the Russians to actually go down the road of using tactical nuclear weapons, they would have to believe there is a direct military threat to major cities and/or Moscow itself. And so I think at this point, the war is taking place in Ukraine right now. I think if we were to see the Ukrainians start to expand long-range strike into Russia itself, that might lead to the Russian consideration of the use of tactical nuclear weapons if their army significantly crumbled and left them vulnerable. But I think what's more likely is actually the threat. Underground nuclear tests, forward deployed forces in and around Kaliningrad is probably at this point where we'd see them threaten rather than use nuclear weapons on the battlefield, as long as the war largely stays contained in Ukraine. Over.
Thank you, sir. I believe we have a question from panel number 1.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Lieutenant Kelbley. I have a question about disruptors, in particular to the first strike disruptor. During World War II, there was a statistic that the first tank to fire in a battle, I think it was like 80% had a chance of winning. Is there anything we can do at a small unit level to increase survivability of that first strike to continue the fight?
Yeah, very good question. One of the things that we're sure of is that, like, for instance, China is watching carefully what happened in Ukraine. The Russians didn't hit the Ukrainians with a first strike that was devastating. It was more of a punch in the face, and by the way, little cousin, you better pay attention because we're coming in, you better surrender. False assumption. The war ended, started badly for the Russians because of that false assumption. And their first strike, even though it hit 2,111 different installations in Ukraine, was not devastating. China certainly is learning from that, and my guess is when they hit Taiwan, it will be absolutely devastating. Otherwise, they haven't learned, and they'll have a fiasco. So our challenge is just what you're thinking. How can we protect ourselves in this first strike scenario if we're deployed somewhere, particularly if we're in the Pacific and we know that their first devastating strike will be amazing, or if we're in Europe and we're in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, any of those, Poland, and the enemy decides to strike us for whatever reasons. We have got to think through those masking issues that I mentioned, and we've got to try the best we can to disperse our forces, make them hard to target. In other words, deceive the enemy sensors and disrupt their targeting. And one of the ways you can do that is occupy towns and cities. If you occupy assembly areas in open areas, on Google Earth, they'll see you the day before and they'll know that you're there. So we have to rethink how we are in the first stages of this fight. I was just talking with the commander of the National Training Center about how it would be interesting to change the structure of how we do NTC, so they arrive, a battalion and then a brigade, as we normally would, in assembly areas, and their job in that first couple of days is to mask so they can't be easily seen. That would be something that would be beneficial for us to learn, but very good thinking.
Rich, can you hear me? Yeah, just a quick question for Seth. And because you're looking at the Office of Net Assessment, you're probably looking at this problem set from a joint perspective also, right? Not just the Army. And we're obviously become very reliant in a good way on our joint partners. And I'm just curious what insights you're seeing with respect to Air Force, Navy, or other that might be of interest to us, because we've obviously got some dependencies from a strike standpoint and aerial reconnaissance and other things that we're used to getting from our Air Force partners. And I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts on that would be. Over.
Yeah, a couple here. One is it's a reminder to our other services that we are not not just about air-sea battle. This is a reminder that there is a significant land fight. But I think some of the interesting things that come out of this war that are a reminder are, one of them is really, are we well positioned for a protracted long-range fires war? Do we have sufficient munitions supplies? As we look at the logistics in a contested environment, think of a Taiwan Straits scenario. Can we get sufficient munitions for naval, Air Force, and Army units into theater quickly enough? Do we have them? I mean, one of the concerning signs of an unclassified war game we just ran is how quickly we ran out of munitions in a fight and did not have sufficient numbers of munitions for several days, past a week of war. And I think that is something that we've got to take a step back. We are no longer in a counterterrorism situation. The 9/11 years that I spent in Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places, we're looking at pushing for an industrial base that is able to fight a protracted war against a major adversary. That means weapon systems that are able to withstand. That means all of the masking that we talked about earlier, but that also means munition supplies. And I think we have a ways to go before we're there. So that's probably one of the biggest single issues I think that I would highlight. I mean, lots of others that we can talk about offline, but that last one is a serious concern right now.
A quick add to that, most of the drones in the world are made in China. So when you look at the Chinese ability to scale up a drone industry versus anyone else, it's a pretty tremendous thing. And drones, of course, are the generic term for loitering munitions, unmanned combat aerial vehicles, ISR, UAVs, the whole UAS family. So that's interesting to know. We need to do better in the United States, and the depth of our industry in being able to fight a protracted war is really a challenge for us right now.
And if I could just add one other component to that UAS discussion, the UAS networks, the battle networks that we're seeing really are an ability to be able to talk across services here, because the way UASs, I think, are likely to be used in the future is to be able to talk across land units, aircraft flying from not just U.S. Air Force, but also allied and partner air forces, and also naval platforms. So this does get to that joint all-domain command and control system that a lot of these platforms, UAS is probably the clearest example of that.
Sir, I believe Dr. Johnson also wanted to comment. Dr. Johnson, comment?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
So I'm going to make I've been kind of in total situational awareness hell here, which gives you an indication of how well all these systems will work under fire. But I want to raise something that Seth raised as a segue into talking about, I believe we're looking at most of these lessons from our perspective, conditioned by a Ukrainian perspective. And we're seeing a lot of what we want to see. We see an army that is poorly led, that is having difficulties because of that. We're seeing officers killed because they have to go micromanage from up front without asking ourselves, how do we do the same things? But back to the question of nuclear weapons. This is one I think that is critical. Putin, Seth said that the Russians will only respond if we go after the command and control systems and against Moscow. If you read Putin's directive, what he says, even with conventional attack that threatens the homeland of the Russian state, he will resort to weapons of mass destruction. In other words, if you step into Russia, he views tactical nuclear weapons as an option. Back in the 80s, the stuff we've uncovered since the Cold War about Russian war plans, they viewed small-scale nuclear weapons as just another large-scale weapon. So commanders on the field have to start thinking about, not that this might happen in extremis, but they should expect if they cross into adversary territory or the adversary believes are being threatened with physical destruction of their ground force, they will resort to this. You have to start thinking about how do you deploy, how do you use your information system so they won't get fried, so you can survive these kind of events. But I just caution all of us, the biggest barrier to us learning from this war is our own hubris about who we think we are and looking for things there that are validating how we would do things or what our current programs are. We really need to use this as an opportunity to zero base and say, how would we have done either as the Ukrainians or as the Russians? Over.
Thank you, Doctor. So we have time for approximately 1 to 2 more questions. Any more further questions from the audience? Panels? Panel 3?
So, John, good to see you. Been a long time since AOB 77. So I'm a retired Army guy, and so I'm coming to the conference for many, many years. And one of the things that I'm now a little confused about, we're into our 3rd or 4th session on takeaways from the recent conflict. And we talk about, Chief talked about it, contested logistics. And yet I don't see, other than that phrase, that catchword, that we're actually doing any thinking about that. What does that look like? There was a comment yesterday about training convoys for aerial attack. But from your takeaways, you've got a lot of tactical maneuver stuff, but what are some of the takeaways on the contested logistics? Having those convoys, even if it's 4 vehicles, survive to get all that ammunition that we now know we're going to need. Are there some observations you can share? Because those contested logistics observations are extremely valuable to the maneuver forces. We're thinking and training our way for, our LISCO operations. Thanks.
Hello. Okay, good question. Thank you. Good to see you again. So none of this was just about combined arms and combat arms. All of these things, the transparent battle space, the idea of being able to survive the first strike and the top attack, that hits logistics even more so. In fact, you're precisely right. If you're the enemy, just take out their logistics and then what? If you look at how our CSSBs are contained in the National Training Center, I was just there last week. I spent 5 days on the ground. The first thing I went to was logistics areas. This is a growth industry. We really need to think through the TTP of how we're going to survive and mask those capabilities. And you're right, if you disperse them all, you need more leadership, and we need to be able to move in convergence to get things together and offload supplies, and it's very difficult. I watched video after video of loitering munitions in the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War and unmanned combat aerial vehicles, Bayraktar TB2s, following supply trucks to the large logistics support area, and then once finding it, killing everything inside of it. So our challenge is that our logistics is extremely weak right now in being able to survive this transparent battle space with top attack, long-range precision fires capabilities. And that will be a primary target: command post, fuel dumps, ammo depots. So we've got to look at what's happening in Ukraine. The Russians are dispersing their supply areas. They are going into smaller groups, but that's causing them logistics hiccups because they can't get it all to work and they don't have the leadership at the smaller level. We've got to think through that. So we need logisticians to truly get into the game here and think through all that and come up with some really good wargaming on how they think they could do it differently. And the challenge we have is that we have very soft-skinned logistics. We don't have many armored logistics capabilities. So trucks and all the other things that we need, all the way from ships to trains to trucks to areas, those things are highly vulnerable across the whole spectrum of the MDO framework. And we've really got to think through that. So it's an excellent question. I'm not avoiding it. I only had 15 minutes, so I had to talk about 3 things, but you're precisely right. This is something we really need to look at and start thinking about strongly, because we will not survive the next fight and win if our logistics is destroyed.
Thank you, Mr. Antal. You have other
Just
comments? Sir?
briefly, the looking at, and again at I think we've got to be careful about the fog of war still a couple of days into the counterattack, but the Ukrainians have already started to learn some lessons on logistics, operating in a contested environment in the Kharkiv counterattack, in distributed logistics vehicles, a lot of masking, making it difficult for the Russians to understand which are vehicles with logistics, with spare parts or food in them. This goes back to what you said earlier. I would look at some of the lessons we're already seeing in the last few days from the counterattack on air defense, the way the Ukrainians have used air defense in some areas to protect against incoming cruise missiles into logistics depots. So a couple of things. This is where some of these case studies are actually quite helpful.
Thank you, sir. Panel 3, we have a question.
Gentlemen, thank you for giving the presentation. As I'm sure many of you have watched the Russians putting old T-62s on railhead and bringing them up to the front and putting those tanks on the flat and expecting them to fight, how are we going to sustain the armored force in Lisco without having to resort to what the Russians are doing, raiding old stocks? Thank you.
Dr. Johnson, do you have a comment on that?
Could you hit the last part? I'd be broke up on me. I can barely hear you. What's going on?
Okay, let me try.
Okay, let me try. Okay, let me try. Okay, let me try.
You tried. The challenge of the industrial base and how we can resupply, major end items, tanks, Bradleys, all these things. We're really pretty good at that as a nation. We haven't practiced it a lot lately. We haven't done like reforgers like we used to do. We're getting into the thinking. What we need to do is think about how to preserve the force we have right now, and that's why masking is so important and changing our thinking is so important, because if we lose what we got and lose all of you, we're really in trouble. Because it's very difficult to replace a lieutenant, a captain, a major, a colonel. It is very difficult to replace major end items too, but those are a little easier than the personnel. Our asymmetric advantage is still all of you executing mission command. And by the way, all of you know exactly what mission command is, right? If I asked you to define mission command in your own words, you'd be able to roll it off immediately, wouldn't you? Yeah, think about that. You should know precisely in your heart and in your head what mission command's all about. You should have it written down and you should know it, because if you don't, you can't teach it. And if you can't teach it, we won't do it. So you got to do it. And so what we need is to preserve the force that gets into the fight. That's why I keep harping on the idea that we're going to move into places and the enemy's going to have an option to first strike us. Now, maybe we'll be really smart and preempt his first strike, but that would take great intelligence, and we haven't done too many smart things, in a long time when it comes to knowing what the enemy's doing. So what we've got to do is we've got to be totally ready to mask our forces to the max. We've got to be able to train to the level that we understand and can execute mission command if command and control is disrupted. and we've got to take that fight to the enemy in a combined arms and long-range fire, precision fire combination. And that means we got to change some of the way our tactics work too. We've got to start getting loitering munitions and more unmanned aerial systems into the force. We've got to be able to create something that I call a persistent precision strike zone over the enemy so that we can use a combined arms, loitering munition, long-range precision fire approach to hit the enemy and take them down and then move our combined arms forces in to maneuver on them and make maneuver important again. So to do all that, we need better thinking, and what you're thinking now is really important. So keep up the thinking and keep up the studying and dialogue amongst yourselves, because you will change our Army.
Mr. Jones, Mr. Antal, Dr. Johnson, thank you very much for your comments and time today. It's greatly appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause.